In the spring of 1913, the desert was already changing. Across the arid stretches of the American Southwest, the rains had failed for a second consecutive season. Newspapers in Arizona and New Mexico carried small notices buried between livestock prices and railway schedules, warning travelers of sudden windstorms, walls of dust that could rise without notice and erase the land in minutes. It was during this unsettled year that a small party of desert travelers set out along an old trade route west of the Gila River. The route was not marked on most modern maps even then. It followed dry washes, abandoned wagon ruts, and the memory of those who had crossed it before. The group consisted of 4 men. A man who had crossed the desert for more than 20 years and rarely spoke more than necessary. Their names appear only briefly in surviving material shipping logs, a short entry in a survey ledger, and fragments of a journal later recovered from a private estate sale in Tucson. None of the documents were written with any sense of anticipation. They record ordinary concerns: water rations, mule condition, wind direction. The desert at first offered nothing unusual. Days began before sunrise. The men traveled in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the dull rhythm of hooves. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down hard enough to slow their pace. At noon, they rested beneath canvas shade, measuring water carefully. At night, they slept lightly, the stars sharp and unmoving overhead. Yet even in these early entries, there are subtle irregularities. On the second day out, the survey assistant noted that the wind had shifted against expectation, coming from the south rather than the west. On the third, one of the freight men complained of hearing movement beyond the firelight, dismissed at the time as wind, disturbing scrub or distant animals. Moreno, the guide, reportedly said little, but one line attributed to him appears in the journal margin, written in a different hand: storm signs too early. Air wrong. By late afternoon on the 4th day, the sky took on a color none of them could easily describe. Not the darkening of rain clouds, but a flattening of light, as if distance itself had been reduced. The horizon blurred, the sun dimmed without setting. They debated whether to make camp early. Moreno advised stopping. He pointed to the ground, where the sand had begun to move in thin, crawling lines, sliding against itself. He said nothing more, only shook his head once. When they stopped, the desert seemed unusually quiet. No insects rose at dusk. No birds crossed the sky. Even the wind, though steadily increasing, carried no familiar sound, only a low, continuous pressure, as if something vast were moving far away. One of the men later wrote that the stillness made him uneasy, in a way he could not explain at the time. Another remarked that the mules refused water, turning their heads aside no matter how long they had traveled. As evening settled in, the temperature dropped sharply. The men secured their gear, anchoring canvas and checking knots twice. In the distance, the sky darkened further, not with clouds. Something off about the sound. It would be the last ordinary entry he ever made. The storm reached them just after nightfall. At first, it came as expected: wind rising steadily, sand thickening the air, canvas snapping under strain. They worked by instinct, securing the wagon, tying down supplies, turning their backs to the gusts. Desert storms were not unknown to them. Each man had endured them before and believed he understood their dangers. The sand did not sweep across the ground as usual. It rose vertically in places, forming narrow columns that collapsed almost as soon as they appeared. The men shouted to one another, though their voices were swallowed almost immediately. Sound seemed to travel poorly in the storm, muffled and distorted, as if absorbed by the air itself. It was during this confusion that the first disturbance was reported. One of the freight handlers, identified only as Seawalker in a later statement, claimed he heard something moving beyond the reach of the lantern light, not the skittering of small animals or the uneven rhythm of hooves, but a deliberate motion, slow and heavy, crossing the sand against the wind. He called out, assuming at first that a mule had broken its tether. No one answered. When he turned, he realized the others were standing still, listening. The sound came again, a dragging pressure, like fabric pulled across stone, followed by a brief pause. Then another. Moreno reportedly crouched and placed his hand flat against the ground. He remained there for several seconds, unmoving, before standing abruptly and signaling for silence. The men later disagreed on what happened next. One claimed to see a shape pass through the storm, no outline, only a darker movement within the dust. Another insisted there was nothing visible at all, only the sensation that something large had crossed close enough to disturb the sand around their boots. They attempted rational explanations. A loose section of canvas, caught and dragged by the wind, a pack animal from another caravan, disoriented by the storm. Even the collapse of a nearby sandbank, shifting under pressure. Yet none of these explanations accounted for the direction of the movement. Whatever passed them did not travel with the wind, nor directly against it. It moved at an angle, slow and steady, as if unaffected by the storm's force. Moments later, one of the mules screamed. The sound cut through the wind sharply, high and strained. When the men reached the animal, they found it rearing violently against its tether, eyes wide, foam collecting at its mouth. No injury was visible. No rope had broken. It took several minutes to calm the animal, and even then it refused to stand still, twisting its head toward the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. No further sounds followed. The storm continued to intensify, pressing the men inward. Unwilling to speak what he could not explain. In the journal recovered later, the next entry was written in hurried script, ink smeared by grit. Heard movement, not sure what. Wind wrong. Animals unsettled. Could be nothing. The words appeared deliberately restrained, as if the writer feared committing too much to paper. As the night wore on, the storm showed no sign of passing. And somewhere beyond the veil of dust and darkness, the desert continued to move quietly, deliberately without revealing what stirred within it. The storm did not pass with the night. By what they estimated to be early morning, the wind had settled into a constant, grinding force. The air was thick enough that breathing required effort, each inhale tasting of dry earth and stone. The lanterns burned low, their light reduced to dull halos that barely reached beyond the men's knees. Sleep was impossible. They took turns watching the perimeter of the camp, though the term perimeter had little meaning in the shifting dark. The desert beyond them no longer felt open or distant. It pressed close, contained within the storm, as though the space around them had narrowed. It was during one of these watchers that the disturbances resumed. The survey assistant, stationed near the wagon, later wrote that he felt a vibration through the ground, faint at first, then returning at uneven intervals. Not strong enough to suggest thunder or collapse, but distinct enough to be felt through the soles of his boots. He woke the others. Moreno listened without speaking. He pressed his ear to the sand this time, remaining there longer than before. When he rose, his face was tight, his jaw set. He instructed them to bring the mules closer and secure all loose equipment, though no immediate threat was visible. The men obeyed, unsettled by his urgency. Shortly after, the sound returned. It came from the east, then without pause, from the south. The storm made direction difficult to judge. Yet the men were certain of one thing. The sound was circling, not continuously, It would approach, stop, then resume from another position, always just beyond sight. Each time it moved, the sand reacted, sliding, collapsing inward, leaving shallow impressions that were quickly erased by the wind. One freight handler shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was there. His voice disappeared almost instantly. No reply followed. Instead, one of the tent supports snapped. The canvas sagged sharply, forcing the men to scramble and hold it upright. As they did, the pressure in the air changed again. The wind fell briefly, not stopping, but easing enough for them to hear something else beneath it. A sound described later as exhalation, low, extended, not gusted like wind, but released slowly, as if from a confined space. It lasted only a few seconds, yet all four men heard it. They stood frozen. Moreno broke the silence by ordering them to stay close and remain under cover. He offered no explanation. When pressed, he shook his head once and said only that the storm was not finished. The rational explanations grew thinner. No animal known to them moved this way in a sandstorm. No natural phenomena they could recall produced sound that paused, shifted position, and resumed with intent. Yet none of them claimed certainty. Each man later qualified his account with uncertainty, with phrases like seemed to and might have been. Still, fear began to settle in. Not sudden panic, but a slow, creeping awareness that the situation was no longer under their control. In the journal, the next line was written carefully, despite the conditions. Whatever is out there is not lost. The storm continued to close around them, hour after hour, erasing tracks as quickly as they formed them. And with each passing interval, the movements beyond the camp drew closer, patient and unseen. By the time the sky began to lighten behind the dust, the men understood that the night had not been an isolated ordeal. Something had changed, and the desert, for reasons they could not yet name, no longer felt empty. Morning arrived without clarity. The light filtered through the storm in a dull, colorless wash, offering no horizon and no sense of distance. The sun was somewhere overhead, but its presence was only implied by a slight brightening of the dust-filled sky. The storm had not weakened. If anything, it had settled into something heavier, more deliberate. The men moved stiffly, their bodies sore from cold and tension. Sand had worked its way into every fold of clothing, every seam of equipment. The mules stood close together, heads low, breathing hard, their eyes rimmed red from grit. For a time, nothing happened. That silence proved more unsettling than the noise. They debated their options in low voices. Remaining in place risked exhaustion and dwindling water. Moving blindly through the storm risked separation, injury, or worse. Moreno advised waiting until the wind shifted. He believed it would, but not yet. Shortly after this discussion, the storm changed again. The wind dropped suddenly, not gradually, but as if cut off. Sand fell from the air in soft sheets, striking the ground with a faint hiss. For the first time in hours, the men could see more than a few feet. What they saw unsettled them immediately. The sand around the camp was disturbed in irregular patterns, long, shallow depressions, curving around the wagon and tents. They were not tracks in the usual sense. No clear impressions of hooves or feet. Instead, the ground looked pressed, as though something heavy had passed close enough to alter the surface without fully breaking it. Walker later insisted the marks had not been there the night before. Before anyone could examine them more closely, one of the mules bolted. The animal tore free with a sound of snapping rope and ran blindly into the thinning dust. One of the freight handlers chased after it, shouting, disappearing almost immediately from sight. What followed was the most disputed moment in all surviving accounts. Those who remained claimed they saw a movement rise briefly from the sand between the fleeing mule and the edge of visibility. Not a figure, not a form that could be described only. A sudden vertical disturbance, like a swell beneath fabric. At the same time, the wind returned, slamming back into the camp with renewed force. The man who had chased a mule screamed once. He said the sand in front of it had moved upward, not blown. He said something passed close enough to feel, though he could not say what it was. No one pressed him further. The storm closed in again, erasing the disturbed ground, sealing the desert back into uniform chaos. The men retreated to the wagon, shaken, injured, and silent. The journal. A final line was added beneath the earlier entries. The handwriting was uneven. Not animal, not storm alone, nothing more was written that day. From that moment on, the priority was no longer progress or observation. It was survival land, waiting for whatever lingered beyond the veil of sand to decide whether it would come closer again. The storm began to loosen its grip late that afternoon, not by clearing, but by thinning, its force diminishing in uneven waves, leaving behind pockets of visibility that came and went without warning. The men did not take advantage of the change at first. They remained where they were, exhausted, uncertain whether the easing of the wind marked safety or another shift. The injured freight handler was laid beneath the wagon's partial cover. His wounds were shallow abrasions to the face and hands, bruising along the ribs, but his condition troubled them more than the injuries themselves. He shook uncontrollably despite the heat and struggled to focus his eyes. When asked what he had seen, he refused to elaborate, repeating only that he had been too close. Moreno did not contradict him. Water was rationed carefully. Supplies were inventoried and found mostly intact. Though one crate had been forced open, its contents spilled and partially buried. No clear cause could be identified. The remaining mules were calmer now, but they would not stray from the wagon, crowding close, as if instinctively aware of danger. By late evening, the men made the decision to leave. They traveled slowly, keeping the group tight, stopping often to orient themselves. The desert, stripped by the storm, looked subtly altered, familiar. Landmarks softened or erased entirely. More than once, they paused to study the ground, though nothing definitive remained long enough to confirm or deny what they believed they had seen earlier. No further disturbances occurred. That absences, too, weighed on them. They reached a small outpost settlement 2 days later. Accounts from local records confirmed their arrival. 4 men, 1 injured, all visibly shaken. They offered little explanation beyond having been caught in an unusually severe storm. The injured man was treated and released. No formal report was filed, yet fragments surfaced later. The survey assistant submitted his notes weeks afterward, notably omitting several pages from the sequence. In correspondence with a colleague, he mentioned the storm only briefly, adding that he would not travel that route again. One freight handler left desert work entirely within the year. Moreno vanished from records soon after, his name appearing only once more in a ledger marking unpaid wages. The journal, the most detailed surviving account, ends abruptly. No closing reflection, no summary. The final pages are blank, as if the writer had intended to return to them and never did. Those who later spoke of the incident did so carefully, emphasizing uncertainty, insisting on the limits of what they knew. None claimed understanding. None offered conclusions. They had survived. But something in the desert had followed them long enough to be firsthand. Then had withdrawn without explanation. And that, according to the few records that remain, was what troubled them most. What remains of the incident exists only in fragments. No official inquiry was ever opened. No newspaper article directly described the encounter. In public records, the storm of 1913 appears only as a line item: severe dust activity reported across southern territories, not unusual for the time, and quickly overshadowed by larger events. The personal records are less complete. The journal recovered years later contains no revisions, no later explanations. Its final written line, "Not animal, not storm alone," stands isolated on the page, followed by several unused leaves. There is no indication that the writer ever attempted to clarify or expand upon it. Letters from the survey assistant suggest reluctance rather than fear. He wrote of the desert as unreliable, advising others to trust local guides over instruments. In one note, he added that storms sometimes move with purpose, though he offered no further detail. The injured freight handler never gave a formal statement. According to family accounts recorded decades later, he refused to speak of the incident, except to say that the desert had risen up during the storm. Those words were repeated cautiously, without embellishment, and only after his death. As for Moreno the guide, his disappearance from the record is not remarkable by itself. Many men working the desert routes left little trace. Yet those who remembered him described a man who avoided certain areas without explanation and who watched the ground as much as the sky. No physical evidence survived. The storm erased what little there may have been. The altered sand, the impressions around the camp, the place where the mule ran, all were reclaimed by the desert within hours. Later travelers reported nothing unusual along the route, though some mentioned sudden storms that seemed to arrive ahead of schedule. Interpretations vary. Some later writers suggested misjudged weather patterns, rare atmospheric effects, panic under extreme conditions. Others pointed to animals displaced by drought, moving in unfamiliar ways. Each explanation accounts for parts of the experience, but never the whole. What the men encountered, if anything at all, left no lasting mark on the land, only on those who passed through it. The desert offered no confirmation, no denial. It did not pursue them beyond the storm. It did not announce itself again. It simply resumed its silence, vast and indifferent, as it had been before. And in that silence and broken, unresolved, the incident was left to rest, recorded just enough to be remembered, and never enough to be understood.